Welcome to Cyber Insecurity, brought to you by INE. I'm Matt Kreischer, content specialist at INE, and as always, I'm joined by Neil Bridges and Jeff Goals. Neil is a cybersecurity veteran, both literally and figuratively, starting with Cyber Command at the U.S. Air Force. He has since worked with Fortune 100 companies and PricewaterhouseCoopers. He's currently consulting through his company Root Access Protection. Jeff is a named account manager with VMware Carbon Black. He has more than 30 years experience in the technology and cybersecurity sectors, helping clients around the world achieve first-class security protocols. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt.
I want to start out with a pair of stories that are kind of tangentially related. We'll start in South Africa with our friends at Equifax-South Africa. The credit monitoring company was hit with a social engineering attack, but if you ask the CEO, Ferdy Peterse, that's just the price of doing business. The CEO, whose name I will not butcher again, spun what is on all accounts a cyber attack into some of the strangest language I've seen out of a major corporation, forced to reveal a breach. Here's what the executive had to say. Our investigations indicate that an individual in South Africa purporting to represent a legitimate client fraudulently requested services from Experian. The services involved the release of information which is provided in the ordinary course of business or which is publicly available. So, Neil, what do you make of that statement?
I'm at a loss for words. This is one of those super weird, instances where, you don't know whether he's the smartest dumb guy on the planet or the dumbest smart guy on the planet. And I say that, with all due respect to the fact that he is the CEO of a major corporation, but he's
the smartest smart guy if he can actually get away with this. Because this is total ridiculousness.
It is total ridiculousness. I mean, it's like So I've been having conversations with folks over the last few days since this came out to really kind of get to see if we in cybersecurity aren't just we're so quick to crucify people, whenever they come out and say stupid stuff like this, that are we really blind to what's really happening here? And one interesting perspective that somebody did lend themselves to me was, this is all about liability, and so if they're able to hide behind the fact that this wasn't actually a hack and that social engineering isn't actually a hack, then technically they weren't actually hacked. And so therefore things like cyber insurance become into play, things like the regulatory bodies that govern them come into play and things like that. And so it calls into question, really back to some of the conversations we've had on previous podcasts about the teeth that are embodied in some of these regulatory agencies that are seeking to try to protect consumer rights and privacy.
Yeah, that famous regulatory body in South Africa that's has a lot of teeth, like GDPR. Oh, wait.
I was like, I don't think, but that's the point, though, right? Is that they're trying to avoid that level of scrutiny, and this is just playing word games with what the definition of a hack is.
Well, and you brought up a really interesting point, and I got to give you kudos for this, which I'll never repeat. But, I think this really does boil down to how does cyber insurance see these kinds of attacks? And if you can get away with not calling it a cyber attack, but you're still liable for some other regulatory body, are you absolved from getting help from cyber insurance while at the same time having to pay out? There's I think the cyber insurance piece of this is awfully interesting.
Yeah, and I mean he goes on to talk about if I recall correctly, right, about how there was no actual use of malware, there was no compromise of any system, there was no this wasn't gross negligence on the part of their company, but I think that all of that is just more scapegoating, if you will, to the fact that you allowed an attacker to take data, and I'm still not convinced about it being the course of normal business activity, but that basically means that social engineering, like if this were to stick, and I think about this like in the case of and I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV and I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn last night, if they were able to convince a court that social engineering is not hacking, do you realize the precedence that would set?
Oh, huge. Well, I mean, you look at the scale of this thing, too. I mean, 24 million South Africans.
Yeah.
Their data. 24 million. Like, what is the population of South Africa? I don't even know.
23 million. I actually don't know.
I almost would have believed you if that was.
But I mean, in addition to that, you've got almost 1 million businesses, 750,000 businesses too, on top of that.
But doesn't this kind of fly, not kind of, to me, this flies in the face of logic that's been set up on precedent that we've had for decades now, that social engineering is part of cyber criminal activity. Whether he wants to call it a hack or not, this is a cyber criminal activity. And also, just because he's not saying that there's gross negligence, Neil, doesn't mean that there wasn't gross negligence.
Well, and any investigation is going to determine truthfully whether there was gross negligence or not. And to answer your question, Jeff, because I did Google it.
I know, I just did too.
For the people who are listening, there's 58.56 million people in South Africa.
42%.
So 42%. Look, I got the number, and Jeff got the percentage. So that's 42% of the population of South Africa that just got owned by this. But I think that's what we're really saying there, Matt, is that everywhere else, if I were to call up a bank and purported to be some individual inside the bank to gain access to account numbers or personal information of somebody that was at the bank, in the U.S., I think you'd have a hard time convincing a judge that wasn't, malicious activity or some type of Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, type violation.
Yeah, to me, that's the big thing is that it seems like I don't think that the CEO is being as radical as we may be giving him credit for. I think that he is covering himself, and I think it looks to me like a short-sighted way of covering yourself, but in a way that can be read like he's playing, 3D chess when it's really just, hey, what if we try this thing?
Yeah, well, what's the difference between this and an insider threat? I mean, an insider threat doesn't necessarily fall under the category of hacked or cyber, because they're doing things that they're normally supposed to do. But it doesn't mean it wasn't really, really bad. Certainly breached, not hacked. Who cares what the difference is? This is semantics here.
It's data protection. It's data protection is all it is, and that's why I think that's why most.
So you're saying it depends on the definition of breached and data protection, and is a breach loss of data, or is it some mechanism, either personal or technically, that is allowing for data to leave your organization?
Well, and I think Matt hit it best, right? I think it's saving face, right? You've got a guy who's being interviewed on TV. He's saving face by saying they weren't hacked. Now, come on, was there a
in no way, shape, or form?
Yeah. Was there a piece of malicious software that was deployed to the system whereby an adversary had remote access to another terminal? No. Did somebody socially engineer your folks to give up personal data? Yes. I think the courts will decide whether it's a breach. I think he's arguing semantics for the public opinion side of things. But I think the regulatory body that doesn't exist in South Africa will ultimately have to determine whether he's liable from a data breach perspective.
Well, I think what's interesting, this is obviously a pretty smart, savvy attacker, which we've talked about before, by the way. And I believe I believe I won that argument, and you're still shaking your head no, but I think I did. But you take a look at what this hacker. Oh, I'm going to just talk over you because then I win. But really if you take a look at what this attacker did, he didn't go to Experian to get all of the data. He went to them with some data and said, "Oh no! All I need is the contact information. I already have the ID and the name." And so he's using this as one more step in building out the profile of 24 million people. That's a pretty impressive scale.
You know what? A shark is impressive to a clownfish. Just saying.
Unless you're, Nemo's friends.
Yeah.
And we're still friends too, Jeff.
Yeah.
Before this recording turns into Shark Week, I would like to...
Yeah, exactly. Neil's the shark in this analogy, by the way.
I want to move on to the next subject, but it is, like I said earlier, tangentially related, and it has to do with Uber. The Justice Department recently indicted the former head of security at Uber for allegedly concealing a cyber attack. Joe Sullivan, who was then working for Uber.
But wait, in no way, shape, or form was that a cyber attack. Like, he said it. He should be absolved. He should be free.
Let Matt read the article for the listeners.
Okay.
I'm dying at the bit to just go, is this an oops moment?
Well, I'm actually going to take it a little bit of a different place. But to finish, Joe Sullivan went against federal regulations allegedly and hit a breach that affected 50 million Uber customers. Obviously, if this is true, Sullivan should certainly be found guilty. But what I'm wondering is if he's the fall guy, essentially, and it's much easier to make the case against an individual than it is against a corporation. Jeff, what do you think?
Well, first of all, he's attacked or accused of this breach of what it turns out to be is exactly the same population of South Africa. I love the juxtaposition of these two stories. So no, I mean, the bottom line is he had to have known he was breaking the law. Absolutely had to have. I mean, in the security industry in the last 10 years, there is no one who has been under a rock enough to believe that doing what he did would be fine.
Well, I so slightly disagree with that. Just not that I think that nobody in security thinks that, that it's okay to do that, but more in the sense that it would not surprise me if and I don't want to isolate CISOs on this. I don't want to isolate security people. It would not surprise me if any corporate executive is constantly evaluating a situation to see which part of that gray area, just like this CEO in South Africa, can navigate under. And it isn't unreasonable to think that this guy legitimately had a thought that said, oh, I could totally pass this off as a bug bounty because the public opinion doesn't know any better, the courts don't know any better, the lawyers don't know any better, I'm smarter than everybody else, and so I can ride this gray line and be successful at it more than anybody else. To me, this speaks of just somebody who stepped over the gray line a little too far.
Well, I do want to go back to...
I don't think it's that gray of a line, and it's pretty sharp, and it's pretty clear, and he had to knowingly step over it.
So let's just say that gray line is a little less gray, and he clearly did something wrong. What I find interesting is something that a hack that affects 50 million customers, it's very unlikely that all of the communication at the executive level was siloed to the head of security. So I do want to kind of go back to my original question, which is this guy taking the fall for something that was a structural issue within Uber at the time? Or do you really think that this executive at this public, huge company is the only person that was hiding what was going on?
I have an opinion, but go ahead, Neil. It sounds like you want to talk.
Well, we can both speak to conversations that we've been party to at some of the highest level of some companies that are much, much bigger than Uber, where do I think that a CISO or a head of security could have hidden information from even the top executives of a publicly traded company? 100%. 100%. I don't think for a minute that he was incapable of hiding that. You can see because when there was a new I forget who came in after him. I don't know if it was a CFO or a CIO or somebody from internal audit, that maybe it was somebody from internal audit that came in after his predecessor had left, that they did a review of the breach and found some gross negligence on his part and ultimately ended up firing him. So, I mean, I definitely don't think that it was something that was, nefarious at the upper echelons of all of Uber. I think to Jeff's point, this was somebody who made a conscious decision to execute under this strategy, thinking that he knew more than the people around him or the people that he would be representing, and got caught doing so.
Yeah, this was all about a review. If my review is good enough, I'll get my bonus. This would have made a bad review. I understand that Uber's a technology company, but I think a lot of the same rules apply to a technology company as they do for maybe a behemoth oil and natural gas pipeline company that isn't built at the executive CEO, COO level out of people who coded for a living, right? I think that this guy probably said, ooh, if this information gets out, my job is on the line and I won't get my bonus. And I'm speculating here, but man, this absolutely looks like this is something that he siloed off intentionally and not only hid it from regulators, but also hid it from his executives.
Let me ask you something, Jeff. And I asked my special guest this on my stream on Monday, and I want to get your opinion on this. Do you think that us catching visibility into this is one of those moments we have in our industry where we're starting to see potentially a level of corruption that exists at the CISO level?
I don't think it's necessarily like programmatic. I think it's definitely here and there that there's some, hey, I can kind of, empire build and do my own thing because no one understands what the heck I do anyway. I think there's some freedom to that. And so security's always kind of lived in this own little dark closeted world where I don't really understand what you do, but I hear that you're really important to the business. So
the board tells you that you have to be here. Right, exactly.
And so I'm going to let you kind of do your own thing because I don't know. And I, quite frankly, every time you talk, you bore me. So I don't understand what you're saying. But you're part of the risk team or you're part of, keeping our lights on. But you're a cost center.
Real quick before you do that, though, Matt, because that's very much how I feel about it, too. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this, too, is if you look at like a CEO, a CIO, and a CFO in an organization,
they all walk into a bar. And, I thought you were going to go into a joke.
They all walk into a bar, and the lawyers are there to help them out, right? But they're all fiduciary responsibility inside of a big corporation like that. They're going to go to jail if they mess up on reporting to the SEC, whatever the case is, insider trading, all that stuff. CISOs aren't held to that same level, and so what if this has been going on, and because they haven't been held at that same legal liability level that CFOs and CEOs and CIOs are being held to, what if that's facilitated them being able to fly underneath the radars from that?
Well, I think just with these regulations alone, they are very, very quickly being brought into that world.
So one of the arguments that I've been having with people since like 2013, when House of Cards and Veep came out at the same time, is you really are in one camp. Do you think life is like House of Cards, where everything is planned and strategic and conspiratorial, or are you more in the Veep camp where everybody's just kind of screwing up until somebody makes a decision? I'm in the Veep. I'm kind of in the Veep category of it. I don't really necessarily see this as conspiratorial. I think this is a lot of making quick, short-sighted decisions that dig you deeper and deeper into a hole until you realize that there's no way out. I whether that happens across the board, I actually don't think it's conspiratorial. I think it's the human nature decision of, oh man, I just screwed up. What's the easiest way that nobody's going to figure out that I actually did screw up?
100%.
I agree with that too. I can't fathom in a situation that this would be conspiratorial.
You are for those who have never been like in the heat of an incident, right, where your world is coming crashing down around you. The speed at which you have to make decisions facilitates the likelihood of a lot of errors.
And this is why, when we go back to a couple conversations we already have, why regulatory bodies need to become stronger in the cybersecurity world is because that short-sighted decision making that bunts up against regulatory decision making. That's where people take a step back and say, okay, what kind of trouble am I going to be in if I don't do this?
I would actually take a different approach with that. I think this is why you train and this is why you practice. I think this is why tabletop exercises are important.
Is this the same tabletop exercise that you poo-pooed the idea when I came up with 3 weeks ago?
I have no recollection of that, Senator.
Yeah, Matt, can we get a replay? Just a snippet replay. Yeah, that's what we need to add to this show, right?
I'm adding stenographer to my resume.
Nice.
Yes, Neil, on this date at this time.
Oh man,
Yes. I don't remember saying that. If somebody can find me a clip of that, I'll deny ever saying it. It was a plant by
I have
Matt.
no recollection of that.
But I don't think regulation forces you to take accountability. I go back to my military days, right? If you train on this level of breach time after time again, then it becomes habit to know what it is you have to do, so that you're not left to make the decisions, short-sighted on the spot in the heat of the moment. And if that's truly what this individual did, then I think that muscle memory would have come in handy right about that.
Yeah, I would agree.
I certainly don't think that regulatory bodies are the only way for the only accountability factor. But what also seems to be the case, and this goes back to Jeff talking about how the CEOs are not the ones that are coding, is that there is a communication difference between CISOs and what they know and what CEOs know. And when CEOs see a breach, that is bound to happen. Breaches happen to everyone. But CEOs don't want to hear that, or executives don't want to hear that. So they say to the CISO, well, what did you do? This is your fault. What happened? How did you screw this up? And so without that open communication, there needs to be some sort of accountability, whether it is training or regulation or all of the above.
I'd actually be interested from a listener perspective, CISOs out there, how many times board members have reached out to you to ask you what your thoughts are on de-risking the business. Now, I know you've had those conversations, Neil.
Yeah. I mean, it's. I think the communication thing that Matt brings up is pretty important, because I think that while you've got like a CISO, and depending on whether the CISO reports into like the CIO or the CFO or directly to the CEO, it doesn't matter. Those CISOs most often are the ones who go brief the board on, the risk and the cyber threat landscape and things like that. But it's amazing how, like, outside of those quarterly or biannually board meetings, there's almost no communication or little to no communication, that exists between the CEO and the CISO, on a day-to-day or a month-to-month, perspective in a lot of organizations. So I think Matt hits on a good point that, there isn't, we haven't figured out the magic way to have the conversation. You and I have talked about this before, Jeff, over wine before, is, we haven't figured out that magic translator kit for how do we as technologists or as cyber nerds, right, speak money to the CFO and the CEO in ways that they can understand.
Well, speak money, speak risk, right?
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, moving on to vulnerabilities. 6 months ago, IBM went to work patching a major vulnerability in its, I want to say, Thales wireless communication system, although please correct me if I'm wrong, which is attached to IoT devices such as pacemakers. The vulnerability allowed attackers to take over control of and attack devices that many people use to control their health. I'm going to read directly from the article because I want to talk about the vulnerability protocol that this paragraph explains. These type of large-scale remediation efforts have become familiar when IoT devices sold by a variety of vendors share a common but problematic component. Rather than announce a vulnerability in tandem with the patch, a concerted effort takes place to remedy as many devices as possible before going public. Neil, do you like where the industry currently is when it comes to the timeline regarding when vulnerabilities are found, then patched?
In fairness to that question, I think the short answer is no. I'm not happy with how we're handling vulnerability disclosure to vulnerability patching, but I don't think that the blame lies solely with the disclosures of the vulnerability as much as I do with the folks who are encumbered with producing a patch and corporations who have to deploy said patch. And you've heard Jeff and I, tirade about this as, in shows in the past, is I don't think organizations have still yet been able to grasp, the reality that they need to patch critical vulnerabilities in a rapid fashion. I think that there's an interesting dichotomy that exists in hardware manufacturers like what you're talking about. And we can see it with Cisco, we can see it with other medical device vendors and things like that, where, they do know of a vulnerability, and yes, they will try to patch it before they disclose it publicly. And I think that there is probably some responsible, mentality that goes into that, because they do have the control that they can make it, they can fix the problem before it can be exploited by an attacker, or at least known to be exploited by an attacker.
Well, these kinds of exploits can go way beyond this, though. I mean, I take a look, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, there was investigation done on some medical devices, and they bought a bunch of puts right prior to releasing that information, right?
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, this is all built around, how do I monetize this? And, it was actually a legal way of doing it. It was all public information. Mm-hmm. And just because someone else didn't do the quote unquote research on that vulnerability, you can monetize that very, very quickly. I'm curious to get your thoughts on if you think that falls outside the parameter. Now, this is a little bit different, nuanced part of the conversation of vulnerabilities, and what is the responsibility of the person finding the vulnerability? What is the responsibility of who has to patch that, and how fast is fast, right? We've had some of those conversations, but how far down the line should regulations, step into and address some of the, hey, I just, earned, quote unquote, $5 million by selling short a stock that I knew was going to tank as soon as I released the report that I did my own research on, right?
Well, so I mean, and responsible disclosure, and I'm using my air quotes here for those who can't see it, right? Is a rabbit hole that we have to be careful, because we could go left or right and go really, really deep in either direction on responsible disclosure. I think generally speaking, responsible disclosure, I think they've changed the name to coordinated disclosure now. That tells you how long I've been doing it, because it was responsible disclosure for a long time, and then that kind of bred the concept of irresponsible disclosure.
If there's responsible, there's got to be irresponsible.
That's right, exactly. So I think we have an interesting new world whereby we have bug bounty people, we have independent security researchers who are out there genuinely trying to make products better, and I think we have an interesting scenario that's happening with companies where they're trying to figure out how to embrace an open culture of individuals trying to assist them in their corporate strategies, because typically when you look at some of these companies, they're not very used to that open mindset. They're used to doing a lot of that R&D in black boxes and kind of keeping it very skunk works. And to Matt's point, when there's a vulnerability, they go out and try to fix it as much as possible before the disclosure happens, so that the plume, when it does get out there, isn't very big. I think that if you looked at it from a numbers perspective, as so long as it's more fiscally beneficial for somebody to play the system like they did in the specific incident that you're referring to, then I think that they're playing within the bounds of what is okay, albeit borderline ethical, what it is that they're doing. But there's nothing wrong with it, especially if the company that they tried to disclose this vulnerability to decided that they weren't going to listen to that individual, or they weren't going to pay them for that vulnerability. I've heard horror stories about people who have submitted bugs to Microsoft where Microsoft has downplayed those bugs and then come to find out that they patched them, a month later in a patch release and never paid bug bounty researchers for their money. And so, there's a lot of shadiness that's still going on in the bug bounty industry that,
it's kind of forcing this behavior to some extent.
It's very much forcing this behavior, because you got to ask yourself, right? If I find
if you're not going to pay me legitimately, I'm going to make money less legitimately.
Right. You've got this nugget of gold, and you're walking around like, hey, you lost this, Microsoft. Do you want it back? Well, yeah, but we're not going to pay you anything for it. Well, no, I'm going to take my nugget of gold, and I'm going to go over here to the Wall Street. Wall Street, would you like this nugget of gold?
Yeah.
Right.
And Wall Street always says yes.
Right. Or even worse, like, what if they go to the Chinese or the Russians or somebody else and say, would you like this nugget of gold? I mean, you have to ask yourself that, like, once a researcher has possession of that, it still has value to somebody. You just have to decide which value you want it to have to you.
So you just went down a really interesting direction that, this bug bounty person, right? He's going to say, okay, first I'm going to try to make money doing my job, which is bug bountying. If you don't give it to me that way, maybe I go to the path of Wall Street and sell the stock short because I know it's going to take a dive. Alternatively, if I don't do that, I go to the Chinese or the Russians, et cetera, who are going to monetize it in a different way. But, at some point, this does become very nefarious activity, right? So you are the researcher who sells it to China. At what point are you culpable?
There's technically, and so this is dangerous for you and I both, because you and I have very opposite views of what I'm about to go down next. But this gets into a gun conversation, right? Because you have it. There's currently no law that stops you from selling data like that to anybody that's out there.
Right. And my original question was, should there be?
No, there shouldn't be. There shouldn't be. We shouldn't regulate. We should no more than we should regulate other things of equal, type of construct. We shouldn't regulate the distribution of that data.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what. Since we're getting on to shaky grounds here, I'm gonna change the subject.
No, I want you to respond.
There needs to be at least a glass of wine over this one.
This one might be a dinner conversation.
We're still going to repick this conversation is not over. We're just not going to record it.
Exactly. Do
we want to sell that one on pay-per-view?
Yes.
I don't think anyone's interested in where we will take that one.
Well, the last topic that I wanted to discuss is a new botnet. It seems that a new advanced botnet was recently discovered by Guardicore. According to Wired magazine, the botnet, which is called Fritz Frog, uses proprietary software written from scratch to infect servers and corral them into a peer-to-peer network. The botnet Fritz Frog has been at the heart of attacks on governments, banks, universities, and telecom companies throughout the U.S. and Europe, but it is still fairly new and may be growing. So, Jeff, what did you find interesting about Fritz Frog?
Just the fact that it is one other mechanism in a long line of mechanisms that are designed to exfiltrate data from a company without them knowing. It's call it whatever you want. It is no different than any of the others that NGAV solutions try to guard against.
I think if we're really going to put any type of spin on this, right, this gets into the difference as to when you're looking at your controls and when you're looking at your solutions, this is the difference between picking up on signature-based malware that everybody else out there in the world is more than capable of detecting, and looking at the controls that are specifically set up to look at behavioral analytics and tactics, techniques, and procedures, and some of the more empirical things that cyber criminals are doing to infect organizations, and making sure that your controls are established to look for those types of anomalies. When we talk about, we could crush on AV all day long. We could crush on signature-based detections all day long, and just how broken they are. This is why
it's probably the one thing we agree on most.
We can agree on the wine usually when we go out drinking.
I pick it, you drink it, and
see, that's an agreement, right?
Perfect agreement.
But I mean, I think that one of the nuances, right, when you read about this, right, is it sounds like, oh, this is just yet another botnet. Remember, this is code that these guys custom created from scratch, which means they didn't buy it from anybody, they didn't steal it from anybody, they didn't borrow snippets from Poison Ivy, and so therefore you've got signatures from that you can add. These guys wrote this stuff from scratch, which means that you're going to write a signature, but you may not know everything about its behavior, you may not know what it does. You're going to spend months, if not years, trying to figure out how this malware behaves, and you're probably going to be N-2 or N-3 revisions behind it. That makes for a very, very dangerous situation for a lot of organizations.
It says 20 versions of the software binary since January. I'm shocked that it's that low, because the simplicity of changing a binary is like, okay, add a space. Okay, next one, add 2 spaces. It's super simple. So, you talk about AV and how it detects things. AV is uniquely ill-equipped to not only see this, but as soon as you see the second version, let alone the third version, you're completely blind to it. And it's completely allowed to run. And I don't think it's necessarily this software in and of itself that is the pure evil. It's what this software allows you to do once it is installed, right? Yeah. It's all the scripting and all of the connectivity that will render other tools useless in detecting it and stopping it. And so, to your point, Neil, you've got to stop this. It's got to be earlier in the kill chain, and it's got to be behavior based, because you're never going to stay ahead of all of the versions that are going to be available in your environment.
No, I think the takeaway that I would send to people right with this is don't look at this article as, oh geez, yet another botnet. Like this is yet another example of the sophistication that criminals are going through to defeat the commodity set of controls such as antivirus,
and keep themselves anonymous. They talked a little bit about this being peer-to-peer and just the design of it. Okay, I found the step. Okay, what happened before the step? Well, it was a peer-to-peer negotiation between this endpoint and that endpoint. Okay, great. So now we've got step number 0. No, that was 843,000 steps to get to that step. The peer-to-peer makes it extremely difficult to find the initial attacker and in a court of law go against them, right? And so that's what makes this one a little bit more unique than others. I mean, we've seen peer-to-peer, and we've seen some of these other kind of payloads that allow for you to do scripting attacks and other things, but putting them together is a brilliant move by the attackers. But it, again, is one more tactic and technique and procedure. We talk about TTPs all the time that should be easily identifiable with the right kind of tools.
Yeah, exactly.
So let me ask you this then. One of the things that really was interesting is that this botnet was created from scratch, like you said, Neil. How difficult is that to do?
Are you a programming genius or are you Jeff?
Well,
come on. I've got my Fortran and Pascal books right on my bookshelf.
It's probably been there for 40 years.
One of the things one of the things the article talks about is this is a fairly advanced botnet that was built from scratch. I mean, that can't be something that is either easy or not very time consuming to do.
I think we, without arguing the definition of advanced, I'm using my air quotes again, right? Because Jeff and I have already proven we can't agree on the definition of advanced. I think a threat actor or a threat group that decides to take the initiative to build their own botnet from scratch shows a level of commitment and a level of operational, sophistication that I think most organizations should be worried about, and most of us in the cybersecurity community should take seriously, because it shows, like I said, a level of commitment to the mission, and it shows
organization. We talked about that. I think that was literally our second show. Yeah. We talked about the organization of these cybercrime groups.
Yeah. I mean, that's and so that's why I shy away from the word of advancement, because I think this is more about their commitment to conducting their cyber criminal enterprise and the operational sophistication in which they're planning on doing so.
Well, I like ending the show by saying, glad that we could find ways to help people not sleep at night.
Okay. No. So I do. Before we end, Neil, I bug you every show. You are being brought in as a consultant on this one, and a board of directors goes to the security team and says, "Hey, find out about this. I just read this article." And they say, "I know nothing about it, but Neil's going to come talk to you." What do you say?
I say, let's take a review. Let's look at your controls through the kill chain from boundary to endpoint, and let's make sure that you've done the right steps necessary to look for behavioral analysis, and I'm not talking UBA from like a buzzword sense, but like let's make sure that you aren't relying solely on signature-based detection mechanisms. Let's make sure that you're looking for behavioral anomalies. Let's make sure that you've got some form of EDR on an endpoint that can look for attacker behaviors based on tactic, technique, and procedure, and not based on signature. And let's make sure that you've got eyes on glass that's looking for that, and let's re-up the sophistication of the controls that exist throughout the kill chain to make sure that you've got your soldiers on the front line have all the tools that they need to handle a more sophisticated enemy.
So sounds a lot like an OODA loop from the military person here.
It is an OODA loop. It's make sure that you can observe, orient, decide, and act as quickly as possible. You can't. There's nothing new that I can tell you to do to protect against this attacker versus Re-Evil or Maze or anything like that, right? If they're sophisticated, if they're operationally sophisticated, and if they're committed to their objectives, then that just means that they're going to make fewer mistakes, and they're going to rely less on 10-year-old vulnerabilities and probably more on 1 or 2-year-old vulnerabilities, right? To be successful, they're probably going to be very, very tactically precise in how they execute their operation. And so those types of things you can't fix with tools, you have to fix with people and process.
Well, there you have it, folks, from South Africa to Neil's consulting expertise. Thanks for joining us this week. For the latest episodes, subscribe to INE's The IT Experts Network, wherever you get your podcasts, or check out INE's YouTube page. Neil, Jeff, thanks for joining me again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.